Well, hi, my name is Andy Tidy and welcome back to a brand new series of Canal Hunter. I think that the time has come to venture off the Birmingham Canal navigations and to explore some of the abandoned canals elsewhere. And that has brought me here to Norbury Junction on the Shropshire Union Canal, about 20 miles to the north of Wolverhampton. Now, if I asked you to list a set of inland waterways connections onto the mighty River Severn, I suspect you would probably come up with places like Stourport, Worcester, Tewkesbury, or maybe even Gloucester. But that would overlook an additional canal connection that used to exist 30 miles upstream from Stourport at Ironbridge, near today's Telford. This little network of Shropshire canals was ultimately linked into the integrated canal network here at Norbury Junction, coming out in the bridge behind me. And in this series we are going to track down the remains of the 4 canals which formed this route, plus some of the rather interesting side branches. And whilst this canal looked very much like the traditional narrow canal of the British Midlands, for the most part the boats it carried were very different. And this was all down to the hilly terrain that the canal engineers had to cover. In this series we are entering the world of tugboat canals, canals which carried little rectangular boats which were 20 feet long by 6 feet wide. They carried loads of maybe up to 5 tons. Unlike traditional canals, they didn't rise and fall across the hills using conventional locks. Instead, they were taken out of the water on cradles, lifted up on rails and then put back into the canal at the top or the bottom, where they were tied together and then pulled along in strings and looked and travelled very much like a conventional horse-drawn narrowboat. As much of this route traverses the modern town of Telford, I tend to refer to them collectively as the tugboat canals of Telford. But of course, when they were operating, Telford as a place didn't exist. And Thomas Telford, the canal engineer, had only a very passing interest in the canals of this area when he built the aqueduct at Longdon-on-Tern, but that's all a bit of a different story and I'll come to that later on. Now, I did do a recce of these unusual canals about 15 years ago, but at the time there was no online mapping, there was no satellite imagery and there was certainly no drone photography. It was all done using maps and guesswork. So I am really looking forward to revisiting the area armed with the latest tech. Well, that's it as an introduction to the big picture for the series. I think you really want me to get cracking on the exploration of this line. Slightly perversely, the line that we're going to follow starts here at Norbury Junction, where it linked into what we now call the Shropshire Union Canal. And this was the last link in the chain to be built, the Newport Branch. The Shropshire Union started out as the Birmingham and Liverpool Junction Canal and was finished in 1835. That is quite late in the British canal building era and was actually at the start of the railway era which followed. And that is why the canal looks as it does, all straight lines, embankments and cuttings. And the line out to Newport was built along exactly the same lines. By the time this canal came through Norbury, the Shropshire Canal network was already developed as a standalone entity, and there was clearly scope to link it into the wider canal network. So, in 1841, a new line was driven through Newport and onto what became Wappensall Junction, 22 locks further down the hill. This late addition to the canal network was built to the standard narrow gauge, 71 feet long by 7 feet wide. But it joined the rather narrower Shrewsbury Canal, so it had to have 2 of its locks widened to accept the full-size narrowboats that traded from here. The Newport branch will be the first section that we explore, abandoned just 100 years after its construction. And after being abandoned, the land it was built on reverted to its original owners, and in many areas this has been ploughed back into the fields. So all we're left with is a slight indentation in the land and possibly a field boundary here or there to mark its presence. In actual fact, the last commercial traffic probably took place in the 1920s, and the last recorded commercial boat that went all the way through to Shrewsbury made a passage in 1936. Formal abandonment took place during the war a decade later, and after that it was just left to a handful of private boats that made forays into the weed from time to time. But we start with the substantial Norbury lock flight consisting of 17 locks, which stride down the hill to the farmland below. Along the way, the canal crosses from Staffordshire into Shropshire, and given its remoteness, it's lovely to see that some of the lock chambers have survived. So let's fly over to Alton and see what's visible from above. Perhaps one of the best things about the Norbury lock flight is that there are some remains still to be seen. Behind me you can see Alton Bridge, which is towards the bottom of the lock flight. The top lock still exists, that's a dry dock these days. But inside the woods you can still see some little sections of the old canal and the lock chambers that went with them, abandoned nearly 100 years ago. In addition to all the masonry work and the heel posts for the lock gates, you can even find some remains of the old lock gates themselves. This section is one of the bump plates from the top of the gates to stop the boats from crushing into the lock gates, and you can see parts of the old ladders to help the boaters get up and down to their craft. Let's push up into the woods and see if there's anything else we can see. Now, when the canal was decommissioned back in the 1940s, they put in these sluices in place of the top gates. The sluices still remain, but amazingly, the lock gates are still here in the undergrowth. They are lying just where they were left 80 years ago. It's amazing to walk these old towpaths, which are spaced out about 500 yards apart. These towpaths were last trod by horses about 100 years ago. And if you liked the last lock, I think you're going to love this one. After a bit of wet weather, not only is the canal still in water, this one even still has its gates in place. Now, we can't linger around here by the locks all day, as lovely as they are. We need to get cracking if we're going to get down towards Newport. As I drove over Alton Bridge, I couldn't help but notice that on the fields on the other side of the bridge, the picture is so different to what we find here in the woods. Here we have a flight of locks striding their way up, abandoned through the woodlands. On the other side, it looked like open farmland. I think from here on, a lot of the exploration is going to be done by drone. And I'm going to have to be very careful not to get led astray so that I can find our way all the way out to the River Severn. So let's get the drone up in the air and see what we can see. In an urban setting, these are remains to make you salivate. This really is a perfectly preserved canal bridge. Do you know, these canal hunts can be so frustrating. I've been here before, but I still can't find my way around. There are so few landmarks out here in the countryside. And the fingerprint of the old Newport Branch is very, very faint. But here, at last, we can find remains of the channel out in the fields near Staffordshire. You expect canals to be about 3 or 4 feet deep and about 40 feet wide, and you expect them to have, as Paul Hollywood said, a soggy bottom. Well, this one certainly has the soggy bottom, and we're just coming up to a lock. You can still see a certain amount of water flowing through the canal. We are pretty much at the bottom of the Norbury flight now, and here in the fields you can still see some telltale reminders of the old lock chamber and the coping stones. The lock itself, and this is the top of the lock, has just all been filled in. I would say I am pretty much on the waterline now. So we're coming into the lock chamber, and if I just step to one side and lift the camera up, you can still see Staffordshire beyond us, beautifully preserved. But I've got to come clean with you. I've actually now got to fly the drone a second time. You see, the last time I thought I was at the site of the bridge 100 yards further down the lane, and I flew off at a wrong angle, probably about 10 degrees off. I thought it was strange that I couldn't really see any remains on the ground. So we'll have another go at flying the drone and see if we can't get the right line this time, heading out towards Forton. Now, one of the challenges of the Newport Branch Canal is the fact that there is no public right-of-way along its course. As I've said before, most of its length has been ploughed back into the fields, so one is sort of committed to simply going to all the places where roads intersect it and then going to see what you can find. And that's particularly the case here at Forton, a particularly nice little village about 2 miles downstream from Norbury. Access to the canal in this area is best achieved from the back of the parish church. There is a bridleway that leads out into the fields, so you can get access, and then across the fields you see a bit of a ramp which leads to what was Forton Bridge. These days the bridge has actually been collapsed, but the canal track can still be found coming into its entrance. So let's take a wander down into the canal bed, see what we can see. You never really know what to expect when you come on these canal hunts. Urban areas, they've all been built over, but here it's more a case of buried. I'm now standing in the channel approaching the bridge, and the wing wall coming into the bridge is still apparent in all the undergrowth. But the bridge has been knocked down and the course infilled. No doubt it helps the farmers get their tractors across the fields. Well, having reached the village of Forton, I can tell by the amount of footage that I've filmed And by the way, the batteries are going down alarmingly. There is no way that I'm going to make it to Newport in one episode. So I'm going to call it a day here and wrap up this as the episode 1 of Canal Hunter, featuring the tugboat canals of Telford. In the next episode, we'll continue our journey on from Forton all the way through Newport. But till then, happy hunting, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio.